July 21st, 1861. It was a hot and humid Sunday. Americans from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Providence, Rhode Island, and Brooklyn, New York, marched toward former countrymen. Men who hailed from places like Edgefield, South Carolina, Florence, Alabama, and Oxford, Mississippi. Wherever their birth, their sole intention on this day was to kill or be killed. The country had gone mad. The Civil War had begun. Old animosities and antagonisms that had defined North from South would be settled in American blood. From issues like tariffs, nullification of the Constitution, and the expansion of slavery to abolition, and upsetting the balance of power within the U.S. Senate, these issues that the United States had either compromised or avoided could no longer be ignored. In November 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States. His new Republican Party had clawed its way to the political top, a mere 4 years since its formation. It was a liberal organization, mostly comprised of those who worked the machines that fueled America's Industrial Revolution. It was also a political party forged to stop the expansion of slavery into the western territories of the United States. The southern states rested their economic cornerstone upon the institution of slavery. Lincoln's election signaled a radical political power shift and threatened an economic security that many in the South thought was guaranteed by the United States Constitution. In December 1860, the state of South Carolina voted to secede from the Union and create a new nation. They found sympathy in the Deep South. By February, Louisiana, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, and Georgia had joined South Carolina in secession. Representatives from each seceded state were sent to Montgomery, Alabama to create a new government. And the Confederate States of America emerged, with former United States Senator Jefferson Davis as its president. Several weeks later, on March 4th, Lincoln directed much of his inaugural address toward these seceded states. "We are not enemies, but friends," he said. "We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." One month later, on April 12th, South Carolinians attacked the federal installation of Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. 2 days later, Fort Sumter surrendered. As Lincoln put it, the southern states had constituted combinations too powerful to be suppressed by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings. 3 days later, his administration called for 75,000 Northern volunteers to serve 3 months to suppress the rebellion. The understrength regular United States Army could not put down the revolt without reinforcement from the state militias. Lincoln's call to arms prompted North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, and most importantly, Virginia, just across the Potomac River from the nation's capital, to all leave the Union. North and South, men and boys, rushed to be included in the vast ranks of volunteers being formed to defend their respective nations. Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia were soon overflowing with recruits. Camps of instruction were blossoming. Firemen from New York and rough dock workers from New Orleans formed the popular and elite Zouave units. Companies of infantry, cavalry, and batteries of artillery were being recruited from former farmers, students, and mechanics. These men concocted exotic names for their fighting units: Scots Life Guard, the Tallapoosa Thrashers, the Cherokee Lincoln Killers, the Hibernian Guards, and the Russell Valley War Hornets. After the Northern defeat at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, states from across the South were leaving the Union, and the newly formed Confederacy had just gained its most powerful member. On April 17th, just 2 days after Lincoln's call for 75,000 Northern volunteers to put down the rebellion, Virginia, one of the nation's wealthiest and most powerful states, voted to secede from the Union. The Confederate government hastily determined that their capital should be moved from Montgomery, Alabama, to Richmond, Virginia. The decision would establish the war's front and bridge the distance between the two conflicting capitals to just 100 miles. With troops pouring into Washington, Lincoln's challenge was to find a commander to lead these citizen soldiers in the field. The General-in-Chief of the Army, Winfield Scott, was 74 years old, weighed 300 pounds, and was in no condition to lead the Northern Army into Virginia. Secretary of the Treasury Salmon Chase lobbied the Lincoln administration to put a Buckeye at the head of the Union Army, 42-year-old staff officer Irvin McDowell. McDowell had a huge appetite and was known to eat an entire watermelon in one sitting. But he had had very little taste of actual combat and almost no practical experience commanding troops. Within days of his selection, McDowell was asked for a plan of action. The Lincoln administration, prodded daily by the Northern press and public, needed an immediate response to the burgeoning rebellion and quick retaliation for the defeat at Fort Sumter. McDowell begged for more time to organize and drill his army of 35,000 men. No simple task, considering that at that time it was the largest force ever assembled on the North American continent. General Scott looked past the obvious details, telling McDowell, "You are green, it is true, but they are green also. You are all green alike."
Why don't the Knights of the Red Tape Councils, for you know red tape is predominant, order us into immediate action? Here we remain in dull inactivity, rusting for want of excitement.
By late spring 1861, the Federal Army had entered Arlington and Alexandria, causing the local Southern militia to flee to the rail hub of Manassas Junction, a strategic rallying point only 25 miles from Washington. The junction was the merger of the Orange and Alexandria and the Manassas Gap Railroad lines. Soldiers could be moved quickly from point to point using the relatively new technology of rail transportation. Manassas Junction thus became a strategic possession for both sides, and the railroad, for the first time in military history, would play a very decisive role in the upcoming battle. Confederate President Davis and his military advisor, General Robert E. Lee, were actually building an army around their base at Manassas Junction. The 20,000 Southern troops there were under the immediate command of the now darling of the Confederacy, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, the victor of Fort Sumter and Federal Commander Irvin McDowell's former classmate at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point.
It would be worth 6 months of a man's lifetime to see the 4th Alabama Volunteer Regiment cooking and preparing to cook, the most of whom are the sons of the best families of Alabama, wealthy and educated. It is truly laughable to think how I've seen them at home, the proudest in the land, now stooping to do this, which at home they would die before they would do. But war is a leveler of all distinctions, and what won't men do when home and country and liberty are invaded?
Just to the north of Manassas Junction ran a small yet formidable stream called Bull Run. Its steep banks would impede an attack, and there were only a few fords in the Manassas area where troops and cannon could cross it. One of these was a stone bridge, across which ran the Warrenton Turnpike. It was along these banks that the Confederate High Command in Richmond planned to stop any further Federal advance. While Confederate forces around Manassas were assembling, another rebel army of 12,000 was massing in the Shenandoah Valley near Winchester, Virginia. A 53-year-old West Pointer, General Joseph Eggleston Johnston, led these troops. If Johnston could join Beauregard's army at Manassas, the Confederates could then give battle to the Federals with more equal odds. But Johnston had in his front a Federal command of 18,000, led by Major General Robert Patterson, a 62-year-old longtime friend of Winfield Scott. Patterson's orders were to keep Johnston's army occupied so that it would not be able to march to assist Beauregard at Manassas. But Patterson would prove too old, timid, and slow to handle the assignment. On July 16th, McDowell began moving his 35,000 men toward Manassas. With bands playing patriotic airs, the cry, "On to Richmond," was heard in the ranks. But the movement was slow. The green Northern troops and their inexperienced commanders made just 6 miles the first day. The Virginia heat caused many Yankees to fall out of the marching columns in search of water. Other soldiers broke ranks to pick blackberries or raid chicken coops. The snail-like pace of the Federal advance gave Beauregard even more time to prepare his defense. Aided by Southern sympathizers and paid Confederate spies, Beauregard had valuable resources of intelligence. Southern women loyal to the Confederacy would gather sensitive information from Federal officers in Washington. Then they would charm their way through the Union picket lines to deliver the information to Confederate authorities. On July 10th, rebel spy Rose O'Neal Greenhow sent Beauregard information that McDowell's army was planning to march out of Washington on July 16th. On the 16th, Greenhow sent a confirmation of this movement to Beauregard 6 hours before McDowell's Federals ever left their camps. As the Northern troops marched toward Manassas, Southern pickets were on high alert. By mid-July 1861, the American public, North and South, had little idea of the intense bloodshed and tragedy they would experience over the next 4 years. In the North, the cry was, "On to Richmond," and a quick defeat of the Confederate Army. 35,000 Northern soldiers had left Washington, D.C. on July 16th and were marching south toward an army of battle-ready Confederates. The Civil War was about to commence in earnest. Beauregard's 22,000 Confederates were in a defensive line along a sleepy stream known as Bull Run. Their line was 8 miles long and guarded fords at every potential crossing point. Beauregard expected an attack on his right flank, and on July 18th, it almost happened. That day, McDowell's lead element, General Daniel Tyler's division, took possession of Centerville with little opposition from the retreating rebels. Tyler, elated to see Confederates retreating from his advance, moved some of his regiments to reconnoiter one of the Bull Run crossings, Blackburn's Ford. The Federals quickly run into the frontal musketry of Confederate skirmishers from Brigadier General James Longstreet's brigade, and were eventually caught in a severe crossfire from more rebel troops and cannon on the south side of Bull Run. One Federal officer wrote, "We were in the thick of it a full 15 minutes, the balls humming like a beehive. I'm sure I shall see nothing so close hereafter." Despite orders not to bring on an engagement, General Tyler rushes 2 regiments, roughly 2,000 men, into the fight at Blackburn's Ford.
11 o'clock came, and the men were scattered into an irregular line, some sleeping, others engaged in various diversions, I just put out my pipe and had laid down, intending to try to go to sleep, when suddenly 2 guns went off on the opposite side with a suddenness that showed that they were bent on a storming. The deadly hiss of the many was heard by us for the first time. Men began to fall every second, some dead, others choking as the cruel ball would tear through them.
2 Confederate regiments eventually crossed Bull Run to halt the Federal advance. McDowell was incensed that Tyler had caused a battle in what was intended to be a reconnaissance. His army would sit tight for 2 days before making its next move. As the battle swirled at Blackburn's Ford, Johnston's Confederates in the Shenandoah Valley gave Old Man Patterson the slip and began moving east to reinforce Beauregard. Johnston's plan was to abandon his Shenandoah Valley position undetected by the Federals and march east across the Blue Ridge Mountains. Then his soldiers would board trains headed for Manassas Junction. His plan worked flawlessly. The timid Patterson was immobilized with fear, thinking Johnston was moving on him, and moved his Federals to Charlestown. From Piedmont Station, Johnston's troops begin to move the 30 miles to Manassas Junction by rail, 1 brigade at a time. It is the first time in military history that soldiers use trains to engage in combat. And these reinforcements will prove to be a crucial element in the pending battle at Manassas. On July 18th, Irvin McDowell's Federal Army had its nose bloodied at Blackburn's Ford, their initial thrust toward Beauregard's defensive position at Bull Run. 3 days later, July 21st, his army was again in motion. McDowell's plan is underway, but now changed. Tyler will occupy the Confederates' attention by faking a major attack at the Stone Bridge. McDowell's real attack will fall upon Beauregard's left flank after crossing Bull Run at Sudley Ford. Everything went wrong immediately. Tyler's men, who had the shortest distance to travel to the battlefield, began to move first, clogging the roads around Centerville and jamming the way for units that had to travel the farthest, a serious flaw in McDowell's planning. Tyler wastes almost 3 hours getting his men arrayed in front of the Stone Bridge and takes another hour for his cannon to open fire on the Confederates, the signal to the rest of the Federals that his troops were ready to divert the rebel army's attention. Across Bull Run was a hard-drinking, foul-mouthed Confederate Colonel, Nathan Shanks Evans. His 1,200 Louisianans and South Carolinians stood little chance of defeating part of Tyler's 12,000-man division. The Federal intent was to draw Evans' troops out to return the fire. But the South Carolinian is not duped and keeps his men concealed. The attack at the Stone Bridge should have signaled the Federal onslaught into the Confederate left flank. But a wrong turn along a farmer's path adds nearly 4 miles to one division's route. The leading Federal brigade arrives at Sudley Ford at 9:30 that morning, almost 3½ hours behind schedule. The Confederates had erected 5 signal stations in order to observe and communicate Yankee troop movements. On the morning of the 21st, Confederate Chief Signal Officer Captain E.P. Alexander spots the reflections of early morning sunlight from Federal bronze cannons and thousands of bright musket barrels. The Federals were coming, moving beyond the extreme Confederate left flank. Alexander's signalman wigwagged the message to the station near Evans' position. "Look out on your left. You are turned." By this time, Evans' pickets can literally see Federal troops moving toward Bull Run. Now outnumbered 20-1, the South Carolinian needed reinforcements, and fast. Leaving 300 men at the Stone Bridge, Evans hurriedly shuffles his 900 remaining troops, the 4th South Carolina Infantry, and the exotic 1st Louisiana Battalion, eventually settling on a rise known as Matthews Hill. There they wait as two massive Federal divisions move toward them on the Sudley Springs Road. By 10:15 a.m., their wait is over. Evans' Confederates pour a devastating fire into Hunter's lead brigade, commanded by Ambrose Burnside. Amidst the smoke and confusion, the overanxious 4th South Carolina Regiment mistakenly fires into the backs of the Louisiana. As the battle rages, one Louisiana company, the angered Tiger Rifles, wheels and returns the fire with interest, before their commander, Major Robert O. Wheat, gets their attention back toward the attacking Federals.
They soon got a good range on us, and many a poor fellow was carried gasping and bleeding to the rear. For half an hour, we suffered this merciless pelting when the enemy showed themselves in great numbers in front of the Rhode Islanders. The sounds of their missiles running through the whole scale of warlike music, from the savage rush of 12-pound shells to the spiteful pish of the mini bullet, was ruinous to weak nerves.
Astoundingly, Evans' meager force charges directly into the Federal line. At the lead is the 500-man Louisiana Battalion. Wielding wickedly long Bowie knives over their heads, the Tigers curse, yell, shriek, and cut into their Yankee opponents. Around 11 a.m., Evans' beleaguered troops were reinforced. The rebels who had hopped the cars at Piedmont Station, Johnston's men, had begun to arrive on the battlefield. Barnard Bee's brigade, with the 8th Georgia of Bartow's command, bolsters Evans' right flank. Now the Southerners have 2,800 men on the field at Matthews Hill, but they are still outnumbered 5-1. One Confederate somberly wrote, "I felt that I was in the presence of death. My first thought was, this is unfair. Somebody is to blame for getting us all killed. I didn't come out here to fight this way. I wish the earth would crack open and let me drop in." The attack swirls. Men go forward. Bee's 4th Alabama advances alone into what was becoming some of the most intense musketry of the entire battle. Federal troops fire into them from 3 directions.
A murderous fire was opened on our regiment by the Yankees. It was a fearful position to occupy. The boys stood it with courage and coolness that would have done credit to a set of old and experienced veterans. The colonel, lieutenant colonel, and major of the regiment, one after the other, and in quick succession, were shot down, besides several privates killed and a number wounded.
It was an awful sight to see the dead and dying, and to hear the wounded cry for water and assistance, enough to chill the heart's blood. One poor fellow of an Alabama regiment crawled to our lines wounded in the left thigh. He asked me for water. I gave him a drink from my canteen, rebel though he was.
Almost surrounded, the 4th Alabama was forced to fall back under a hellacious fire. The Federal momentum was building. McDowell now has 2 divisions slamming into the Confederate left flank. Years of pent-up frustration, debate, and emotion belch forth on the battle line. Every minute the rebels hold on buys them more time for reinforcements, but they pay dearly. The 8th Georgia is literally rubbed out by musket fire in just 15 minutes.
This was no battle. It was wholesale slaughter. The very ground opened and blew us to atoms. Our colors were completely riddled. The groans and cries of the wounded were too horrible to be depicted amid the roaring cannon and the bursting of shell over and around us. But we cut the 8th Georgia Infantry all to smash.
The Confederate line was being threatened from their right. William Tecumseh Sherman moves his brigade across Bull Run. Evans' men, left behind at the Stone Bridge, pull back, as do the Confederates battling at Matthews Hill. Seeing their retreat, McDowell rides behind his blue line shouting, "Victory! Victory!" Indeed, it appears so. But the Confederates were not played out yet. They take refuge, consolidate, and rally a mile south of Matthews Hill on the rolling farm of widow Judith Henry. A scraggly hill on her property will become immortalized in military history. It is here, on Henry House Hill, where the Confederates will turn the tide of battle. There's no mistaking that the Confederates had been overwhelmed and routed, but McDowell's Federals had pushed them back as far as they would go. The Battle of Manassas would be won or lost on Henry House Hill. Colonel Wade Hampton's 600-man Legion, just off the trains from Richmond, had run to the battlefield and now advanced to support the decimated Confederate regiments. They quickly find themselves at the forefront of the battle and under severe shell fire. Like other rebel commanders that day, General Thomas Jackson didn't wait for orders to move to the sound of battle. Around 1 o'clock, the Mexican war hero and former military college professor has his brigade deployed on the battlefield. But unlike Bee and Bartow, he decides to place his Virginians just behind the summit of Henry House Hill and out of the direct fire of Federal guns. He orders his men to lie down and wait, though the battle rages with fury. A Virginian remembered, "The firing in our front was terrific, and why we did not render assistance, I could never learn." General Bee rides to Jackson when he hears of his arrival. "General," Bee cries, "they are beating us back." Jackson calmly replies, "Sir, we will give them the bayonet." A few days later, a newspaperman said he was told that Bee cried out, "There is Jackson, standing like a stone wall. Let us determine to die here, and we will conquer." People in Richmond learned of Jackson's troops being staunch and unmovable under fire like a stone wall. Thus was born the American icon, Stonewall Jackson. Yet no one knows for certain what Bee said or what he meant exactly. The remark seems like testimony to Jackson's coolness under fire. But at the time Bee said it, Jackson's infantry had not become fully engaged in the fight. Most of his men were lying down behind the crest of the Henry House Hill, and possibly not standing like a stone wall. Bee will later rally his men into a bayonet charge toward Federal artillery. They will be mauled, and Bee mortally wounded. Overall, the Confederates had reacted well. Their left flank had held under extreme Federal pressure, and Southern brigades from all over the Bull Run sector were marching towards the sound of battle. The fight may have been out of Beauregard's and Joe Johnston's control, but they had been rushing units to the front and directing them into line. Beauregard and Johnston had also helped salvage Evans' broken ranks. Slowly, rattled Southerners begin to form around Stonewall Jackson's solid battle line. Meanwhile, after proclaiming an early victory, McDowell has spent 2 hours reorganizing his scattered force. All the while, the Confederate line grows stronger. By 2 p.m., McDowell has 11,000 men ready to attack 6,500 Confederates. He also redeploys 24 pieces of artillery. One vigorous thrust will break the Confederate line. McDowell might just have his victory.
The rebels gave us a howdy-howdy-do in the shape of a volley of musketry slapped in our faces. We gave them 500 of the same kind of pills. 'Twas the first time we had shot and been shot at in earnest. It was our first gunpowder christening, a species of battle confirmation, so to speak.
Using an old Mexican war tactic, McDowell sends his chief of artillery, Major William Barry, forward with the order to advance 2 Federal batteries of artillery. 11 cannons under Captains Charles Griffin and James Ricketts move ahead of the battle line to pound the rebels with close-range fire. Griffin protests that without infantry support, his guns will be easy prey for a Confederate counterattack. His commander assures him that he will be supported by the colorful 11th New York Zouaves. Griffin doubts that the green, untested volunteers will stand firm under fire. Ever the soldier, Griffin obeys orders. However, as he turns to leave, he tells his commander, "I will go, but mark my words, they will not support us." He unlimbers his guns 300 yards from the rebels and fires into them for 1 hour.
Fire!
Federal cannoneers and horses are riddled by fire from rebel sharpshooters hiding around the Henry house. The Yankees turn their guns on the sharpshooters. At least one of the artillery shells tears through the house, severing the foot of 85-year-old Judith Henry. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Henry dies. While Ricketts directs his artillery fire, Major Barry sends the 11th New York, 14th Brooklyn, and the detachment of United States Marines to his support. The 11th New York is the first wave of infantry sent into the attack. Jackson's Confederates hold their fire until the Zouaves are to the right of Griffin and Ricketts' batteries. Then the Virginians stand and deliver a deadly volley. One Virginian wrote, "We literally mowed them down." The Zouaves, left standing, dropped to the ground instinctively to avoid another rebel volley. But most panic and run. Then the 11th New York Zouaves are attacked by Jeb Stuart's Virginia cavalry.
The appearance of their colors emerging from the road, the stars and stripes, I shall never forget the feelings with which regarded this emblem of our country so long beloved, and now seen for the first time in the hands of a mortal foe. But there was no time for sentiment then. The instant the flag appeared, Stuart ordered the charge, and at them we went like an arrow from a bow. A long line of bright muskets was leveled, a sheet of flame gleamed, and we could see no more. Captain Welby Carter's horse sprang forward and rolled over dead. The smoke which wrapped us from sight also hid us from them, and thinking, perhaps, that we'd been swept away by the volley, they lowered their pieces to load, and in this position we struck them. The tremendous impetus of horses at full speed broke through and scattered their line like chaff before the wind. I leaned down from the saddle, rammed the muzzle of the carbine into the stomach of my man, and pulled the trigger. The carbine blew a hole as big as my arm clear through him.
As the Zouaves are being routed, Griffin sees a great opportunity. He shifts 2 cannons to the right of Ricketts' guns to fire into the exposed side of Jackson's brigade. At about the same time of Jeb Stuart's savage cavalry charge into the 11th New York and 14th Brooklyn, Jackson's 33rd Virginia advances to within 70 yards of Griffin's 2 cannons. McDowell may have the Confederates outnumbered at Henry House Hill, but he continues to attack with small jabs instead of making one final grand assault. And the 33rd Virginia's seemingly minor attack is about to turn the tide of battle.
Seeing a battery of artillery taking position and unlimbering in close proximity and in a place where it could enfilade our troops, Colonel Cummings determined to capture it before it could do any damage. Then came the command, "Attention, forward march, charge bayonets, double quick," and away we went, sweeping everything before us.
There was much confusion amongst the Federals as to the identity of the troops marching toward them. Griffin was convinced that they were Confederates and was about ready to fire his 2 cannons, loaded with deadly canister, when Union Major Barry said, "Don't fire on your support." Griffin yells back, "They are Confederates." Still, Barry forbade the gunners from firing. It was a huge mistake. Battery Commander Captain Ricketts is wounded, along with 100 horses that pulled the cannons onto the battlefield, thus immobilizing the guns. This was the last of us, Griffin later recalled. Hurrying past the shattered Zouaves and artillerymen, the 1st Minnesota tries to stop the growing Confederate momentum.
Fire Zouaves were on our left and the 14th Brooklyn were on our right rear. We had just formed this line when, as if by magic, an opposing force confronted us within pistol range. I plainly saw this body of men facing us and distinctly remembered the white cross belts and gray uniforms. At that moment, some officer shouted, "Don't fire, man, those are our friends!" But in an instant, all was confusion. The whole rebel line opened on us.
Seeing the success, Jackson orders his entire brigade forward, and from that instant, the momentum of the battle shifts in favor of the Confederates. The Zouaves, the Marine detachment, and remaining Federal artillerymen are driven off from the cannons by Jackson's Virginians. Just then, his men are counterattacked by the 14th Brooklyn. Stonewall's Virginians manage a volley into the New Yorkers and drive them with a wild yell.
We were ordered to rise. We leave many bodies of our comrades lying as if asleep, and so hard is it to realize that they are no longer with us that we felt like calling on them to take their places in the ranks. We are ordered forward, and as the long line moves toward the crest of the hill, the sight rekindles our enthusiasm. I can never forget the sight. The open portion of the hill was black with men, and along the edge of the wood we could see the glistening of muskets.
Jackson's men strike again, with Beauregard leading the 5th Virginia himself and shouting, "Give them the bayonet!" These Federal cannon that had so boldly advanced on the Confederates would change hands repeatedly that afternoon. The fighting seesawed on Henry House Hill, Bartow leading the 7th Georgia in one of the many counterattacks that afternoon. A bullet caught him in the heart. In his last words, he begged his men to hold on to their banner at all costs. "They have killed me, but boys, never give it up." Colonel William Tecumseh Sherman's Federal Brigade enters the fight on Henry House Hill, attacking Jackson's Confederates. Though fairly unknown at the time, Sherman will arguably go on to do more to help the North win the war than any other Federal general. Ironically, this will be the only time in the Civil War that these two legendary generals, Sherman and Jackson, will oppose each other. Sherman doesn't fare well, launching piecemeal regimental attacks. He sends in the 2nd Wisconsin, clothed in gray. Jackson's Virginians are reluctant to fire, thinking the gray uniforms to be Confederate. Finally, the Badgers are met with a withering volley. And as they fall back, Federal troops also fire into their gray ranks, thinking them rebels. Sherman next sends in the Scottish 79th New York Highlanders.
It soon came our turn, the whole Sherman Brigade being marched in along with the Zouaves on the right. When at 20 paces from their batteries, enemy poured into us the most deadly volley that has ever been showered on an army since killing with gunpowder was invented. Colonel James Cameron had but uttered the words, "Give it to them, my brave Scotch laddies," which I distinctly heard when the word rang along the line, "The Colonel is dead."
Colonel Cameron was the brother of United States Secretary of War Simon Cameron. Sherman's Irish 69th New York, now alone due to the retreat of other Federal regiments, draws the attention of vicious rebel fire. Sherman's brigade suffers heavy casualties, and his unsuccessful attack on Jackson accomplishes nothing. McDowell's green soldiers are showing severe signs of panic. Many begin to retreat toward Sudley Springs. In their flight, they pass fresh Union regiments moving towards the battle and spread rumors of defeat and panic throughout the Federal ranks. The fighting on Henry House Hill had reached its climax. The stream of Federal soldiers leaving their comrades on the battle line would soon turn into a flood. Colonel Oliver Howard's New Englanders entered the fight on the Federal right flank, southwest of Henry House Hill, near 4 p.m. His men are exhausted. Loaded down with full knapsacks, they have marched for 10 miles to get to the battlefield. Howard forms his brigade in 2 lines and attacks.
Heavy firing was heard soon at the Henry House, to our left and front. A portion of the 14th Brooklyn was retiring to our left, and Ricketts' battery was flying to the rear. The idea of retreat or defeat had not entered our minds at the time. While marching at double quick, I was hit in the right arm, near the shoulder, by a piece of shell which passed across my breast and whirled around and fell to the ground. In the twinkling of an eye, I was transformed from an athlete to a pensioner.
Howard's first line of troops, by now unnerved from the panic they witness on the battlefield, is destroyed. Fresh Confederate reinforcements arrive to meet Howard's second line. Edmund Kirby Smith's Confederate brigade had double-quicked toward the sound of the battle. General Johnston directs Smith to take his men where the fire is hottest. At about 4 p.m., Smith moves past the southern slope of Henry House Hill, west of the Sudley Springs Road on the Confederate left flank. Smith is immediately wounded, and Arnold Elzey takes over command. Elzey's men move quietly through the woods to attack Howard's exposed right flank. Jubal Early's brigade, who had just arrived at the battlefield, reinforces them. Early moves even further to the Confederate left to Chin Ridge and joins Elzey in the attack. It's more pressure than Howard's Federals can take. They make a brief stand and then retreat back across Young's Branch.
They would not halt. One captain shed tears because he no longer had any command. They will not stay together. They will not obey me, he said. So the panic began everywhere.
Early pursues Howard's panicked troops, but admitted later that we scared the enemy worse than we hurt them. By late afternoon, the battle at Manassas had almost reached its conclusion. McDowell's right flank had been smashed, while Federals on the left flank near Bull Run remained idle. This lack of coordination had hampered the Federal cause all afternoon. It was now proving to be their demise. Sensing the victory, Beauregard orders an all-out attack. By 4:30, the center of the Federal line vanishes. Men throw down their guns, leave their comrades, and abandon their courage. The blue mass, disorganized, streams toward Sudley Springs. Others head for Centerville, along the Warrenton Turnpike.
Can I ever forget it? There came an instantaneous suppression of firing, and almost immediately a cheer went up and ran along the valley from end to end of our line. It meant victory.
The roads leading to Washington were choked with a retreating Federal mob. In their midst were a large group of civilians who had followed McDowell's army to Bull Run to watch the battle. Congressman Alfred Ely is captured by 2 South Carolina officers and taken to their colonel, who'd been drinking that afternoon. As the congressman is introduced, much to the surprise of the 2 officers, Colonel Cash points his revolver directly at the congressman's head and exclaims, "Damn your white-livered soul, I'll blow your brains out on the spot." The 2 officers plead that the congressman is a prisoner of war and cannot be shot. The colonel rides away immediately, and Ely's life is spared. Beauregard orders James Longstreet's brigade to cross Bull Run and attack the retreating Federals, but this advance is called off after rumors of a Union thrust on Beauregard's right and rear. By 7 p.m., the rumor is confirmed as false. But there's now no daylight with which to follow up the victory. McDowell's battered soldiers continue their retreat to Washington.
By 8 o'clock Monday morning, we reached our camp at Falls Church, 20 miles away. I was utterly exhausted, my feet were swollen and inflamed, and I had a raging fever. My physical condition was such that I lost all interest in the Black Horse Cavalry or the Confederacy.
July 22nd, 1861. What was to be a one-day battle is now a full-fledged war. At Manassas, McDowell's once jubilant, overzealous army had been transformed into a rabble.
Thank God I've come through it all safe. For 10 long hours, it almost seemed that heaven and earth was coming together. It literally rained balls, shells, and other missiles of destruction. Men all loading and firing as fast as they could. The sight of the dead, the cries of the wounded, the thundering noise of battle, it must be seen and heard to be comprehended. Mine eyes are damp with tears.
The sun rises, but shines not. The men appear shamefaced enough in the streets of Washington. They come along in disorderly mobs and stragglers. Will they never end?
Federal Captain James Ricketts had been wounded in the thigh and taken prisoner. His wife, Frances, traveled from Washington to the Confederate hospital at the Lewis House, called Portici, where her husband was being cared for. She wrote in her journal of what she saw there.
No words can describe the horrors around me. 2 men dead and covered with blood are carried down the stairs. On the table in the open hall, a man was undergoing an amputation of the leg. At the foot of the stairs, 2 bloody legs lay. In the opposite room are 10 dying or wounded men. Next to us are 3, one with a gangrenous thigh where it is amputated. The smell is horrible. No one can dream of the sickening horrors of the place.
Confederate President Jefferson Davis had reached the battle just in time to see its conclusion. He agreed with Johnston that their forces were too weary to follow up the victory. Davis satisfied himself with sending a telegram to the Confederate capital of the triumph. Jubilation swept the South. The belief was that the one battle to decide the war had been fought and Southern independence achieved.
What a stigma upon the 19th century, upon the Republican Party of the North and all of its people, that such a battle should be fought at all. And yet we see in the Northern papers that it is to be fought again and again.
Manassas, or Bull Run, was the largest engagement on the North American continent up to that time. It had been a surprisingly bloody contest, especially since most of the soldiers involved had never seen combat. Many had panicked and ran, but many more stood and fought, which resulted in 3,400 killed and wounded. President Lincoln said to a congressman after the battle that, "It's damn bad." General Sherman later stated that McDowell's Manassas attack strategy was one of the best planned battles of the war, but one of the worst fought. Though a congressional investigation cleared McDowell of blame for the disaster, on July 25th, Winfield Scott placed General George B. McClellan in charge of all the armies around Washington. Manassas would go down in the annals of American history as an end of innocence and the emergence of a 4-year nightmare. The weapons to wage this war would be fueled by the technology of the Industrial Revolution. Yet the romantic Napoleonic tactics would still be used, contributing to over 622,000 American soldiers killed. Ironically, half of these men died from disease. Great social changes would take place. The eventual emancipation of 4 million blacks from slavery and the rights of women were furthered. New definitions of what degree of strength and role the United States government would have in our lives had been decided in military blood. The war between the states would become America's single most defining moment in its history, and Manassas would be our first great conflict on that long 4-year road to the culmination of the Great Fratricide.